Well, thank you all for coming to hear about the 2022 Scientific Infrastructure Support FOA information. I will say this is a continuation of what is well over 2-3 decades of continued support that actually stretches really back almost to the beginning of nuclear energy. The FOA this year has not changed substantially except in one area, and we'll cover that. So I guess we'll just get into it. Go ahead, next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll talk about an overview of the FOA, the way it's integrated into the nuclear science user facilities. I'll talk about the two sort of separate work areas in it, the reactor upgrades that supports the university research reactors in the US, and then the general scientific infrastructure that's really open to any US university that's working on nuclear energy topics. As to follow up on what Drew did, we'll talk a little bit about some best practices, some pitfalls to avoid that we've seen that have caused problems, and then finally supply our contact information. And as a number of people have said already in this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd rather have you do that and have a good application than have something that ends up failing. So the highlights for this year, the funding mechanism is as it was before, funding supplied by the DOE's Office of Nuclear Energy under Aaron Gravel for this particular area. The grants are actually issued by the Department of Energy's Idaho's Operations Office. So that'll be where you'll have a lot of your contacts for contracting and things like that. There may well be questions that you ask me that all I can do is tell you to go and talk to the DOE ID person, because it has something to do with contracts or procurement. As I mentioned, there are these two funding opportunities for the US universities, the reactor upgrades. We do have a list of 25 reactors at 24 universities, excuse me, that are eligible for this one, and then the general scientific infrastructure, which is much more broad. There you can see the FOA number. It was also on the lead slide. It's available with all the others at grants.gov. Applications will be submitted the same way at the NEUP.gov website, the same thing you're used to, or the same thing you'll see with all the rest of these funding opportunities. And there is additional information at the website you see there. Since NSUF helps to support and facilitate this FOA, we host this information at our site. That'll actually be updated this week with current information. There are also things like frequently asked questions there, and maybe some other information, some additional contact information as well. So next slide, please. So you'll see some of these dates are a little bit vague right now. These will be finalized and updated as the FOA is released. Obviously, we expect to release it sometime this month. I heard the week of August 23rd is the target for all of these. Applications are due on the 11th of November. That's a Thursday. They'll be due at 7 p.m. Eastern time, so 5 p.m. Mountain time, 4 p.m. Pacific time. And that is a hard cutoff by the computer system. So if the application, well, you won't be able to have an application come in at 7:01 because the system just will not take it. So that's one of those things that if you're unsure, we can help you out about, but once it happens, it's outside of our control. And of course, as usual, we expect the awards to be announced sometime in June of next year, hopefully in time that you can get them in place for the following fiscal year. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the nuclear science user facilities. I hope you're familiar with us. If you're not, I would welcome you to go to nsuf.inl.gov to learn more about us. But we were chartered, I guess it's 14 years ago now, to provide access at no cost to the researcher to nuclear energy facilities across the US, and in some cases, we've got some around the world, that help you carry out the Department of Energy Office of Nuclear Energy missions. So some of this is through the CINR. We have other ways of getting access to these facilities through the NSUF, but the CINR is sort of our main way to do it. As I mentioned, we also help to facilitate this particular FOA because of some of the work we've done in the past and some of our expertise. So there are some caveats. You'll see NSUF a couple places in the FOA, and one of those is because the Department of Energy really wants to have the biggest impact for these investments in infrastructure. They'd like and they do a lot of this through the NSUF for things at national laboratories, university partners, some nuclear industry vendors that are partnered with NSUF. They also want any applicant to demonstrate the ability and willingness to join the NSUF as a partner. So there is not a requirement to do so, but we have to at least see that you're willing and able. So if this were going to be some piece of infrastructure that would be buried in a bunker a kilometer deep and no one could ever access it, well, that's probably not going to have a lot of impact outside of your particular research group. And that will be considered in the review. If the NSUF determines that the new capability is something we don't have, something that's in demand, something we might have, but is in so much demand that we could use another one, then the institution may be invited to join the NSUF and open up the equipment to other researchers. And those things can be worked out, but those are really sort of the salient points in the FOA about the nuclear science user facilities. And certainly I'm the point of contact for that, for this area, so please feel free to reach out to me with questions. The next slide, please. So thank you. So I mentioned there are a couple of areas that focus inside this FOA. The one is the university reactor upgrades. This is specifically for US university reactors, and I guess I could have shown you a university reactor in that. That's their INL's NRAD reactor. It was a university reactor at one point. But then in the second area is this general scientific infrastructure support. So I'll walk through both of these in the specific areas, specific issues with each one. Thank you. So the award size, the maximum really in both of the two work areas is the same, and that's the full budget. This really shouldn't be expected. You can see the estimated funding levels about half of that. But if some idea were to come through that was so far above everything else, the whole power of the funding really could be focused towards that. We expect to award up to $1.5 million, and this is a big number, but particularly if you were thinking about the other area in the work scope, which is only a much smaller number. This is because some of these projects at university research reactors are quite large. Reactor control consoles, some big structural changes. We've seen upwards of $1 million. So the Department of Energy has made this available, made this number be flexible, so we can accommodate those. Anticipate awarding several smaller awards. I think the number is usually 8 to 10, sort of depending on the funding and the size. Sometimes a little lower, maybe 6 to 10 would cover just about everything. And I mentioned they expect to get about half of the budget, or about $2.5 million associated with this. So the period of performance for these is considered to be 1 year. But I have there in blue, ask for what you need. And the issue here has actually vexed a few awardees over the last several years. Some of these, particularly these reactor projects, can have a long lead time. So while you can get started after you're awarded with DOE ID's approval, a nuclear instruments channel, including the drawer and then the detector, could be a 9-month lead time. So if you've only asked for a year, then you could end up hoping there's no delay because you only have a couple of months to receive and install it after it's fabricated. So be realistic, ask for what you need. You can get a no-cost extension, but there are some specific limitations with that that can end up causing a real problem. And COVID has really sort of battle tested some of these things. So for this one, I mentioned there's a list. That list was mentioned in the FOA there. Only those 25 reactors can apply, but they can supply. So there is one university with 2 reactors, and they can actually submit 1 application for each one. Otherwise, you can only submit 1. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we do have merit review criteria. These differ quite a bit between reactor upgrades and general scientific infrastructure. Here, the goal is really to ensure the longevity and usefulness of these university research reactors. So you can see more than half of the weight goes to safety and security. So we're talking about things, well, just read it to you, enhance the safety, performance, control, or operational reliability of the research reactor systems. So things that are going to make it more reliable, safer. They're already far beyond safe, but these are at least applications that would affect safety systems, things like that. Or the second point, increase the quality, safety, security, or efficiency of the operation. So these are all things like to really focus towards that, keeping the reactor running safely, better, longer. We've had a number of successful applications that have gone to just basically increasing the amount of time or the duty cycle these reactors can operate at. Impact, okay, now this is sort of what more familiar. The potential of requested equipment and so on to facilitate or improve ongoing DOE research. So are you adding something, well, research and training capabilities, so I will make sure I add that in, particularly this year. Are you doing something that's going to allow you to do something new? Utilization, are you essentially increasing the amount of student and faculty use? So that could be buying equipment to teach a new class, or it could be to do a new set of research endeavor. That could be something typically, maybe it was something that you were doing, but you only had one set of detectors. Now, if you buy 3 more, you can teach 4 times as many students. And then execution. And this is one of the ones that we've been thinking about a lot, the capability to implement the full scope of the project. So this does require the applicant to put in some information to talk about how they're going to do it. If you're buying a piece of equipment, the vendor will deliver, you'll plug it in the wall and it's ready to go. That's pretty easy. If it's something that you're going to build, something that's going to require someone else to come in, hey, the university is going to have to knock down this wall and put new ventilation in. Okay, that's tougher. We'd like to see more detail in the project management part of it. Like I said, this is something, feel free to ask questions as we go on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one thing that we are focusing on, certainly based within the merit review criteria we saw before, spare parts for the control systems. So we know one of the major manufacturers was planning to go out of the market. Essentially, they'll still be around in 2024, and that's when they were planning to. That wasn't when they were going to stop making new parts. That was kind of when they were going to stop selling them. So we expect them to actually stop making them at some point, somewhat earlier. So applications looking to buy some spare parts, which maybe seems a little bit unusual since it's not a very, won't have a high research impact because you're just buying parts for something you already have. That sort of thing, long-term operation of the reactor is highly encouraged. Obviously, will not be the only thing funded, but what some of us are kind of concerned about is when this major vendor goes out of business or out of this business, is that when you need a spare part, it's going to be probably made custom. So things we can do now to make this, to sort of get past that, we would very much like to do. Next slide, please. Thank you. So general scientific infrastructure is the other side of the coin, as it were. Sort of the same thing. If a project came through that was so amazing that the Department of Energy decided to put the whole force of the FOA behind it, they could do that for a $5 million project. Typically, the award size would be about $250,000, and that's because there's a university cost match above the $250,000. Period of performance, the same thing. This is a little bit easier to stay within that 1 year project, but once again, please ask for what you need up front. It's not typically a merit review issue to say, oh, well, this person wants 2 years, this person wants 1 year, the 1 year would win. If we would much rather see you ask for the right amount of time rather than have a problem with that later. So under eligibility, U.S. universities are eligible to submit only one application. So I know this becomes an issue with universities with a very vibrant program, as well as maybe material science that does nuclear, a lot of other areas, but it has to be whittled down so we only get one application per university to the GSI area. And as I mentioned, then the university cost match 1-to-1 is required above that level. Next slide, please. Thank you. So general requirements. So this is where we're trying to narrow it down a bit, to at least tell you what we think is probably one of the better things to ask for. So equipment, software, instrumentation, non-reactor upgrade requests. So it certainly is not encouraged to submit a reactor upgrading request and then a GSI request that is really another reactor upgrade request. At least those will not be viewed as favorably as things that not associated with the reactor, at least not directly. So specialized facilities, classrooms, teaching laboratories, and non-reactor nuclear science and engineering research. So I know there's been some concerns in the past about the ability to put in a successful teaching application. Obviously, it looks like that's been remedied for this year. So we'd like to see some of those. And then, of course, once again, as I mentioned, we'd like to see as many people get access to this new infrastructure as possible. We encourage sharing between multiple campuses, multiple universities and national laboratories, and so on. Next slide, please. Thank you. Previously, we had focus areas that were identified through the NSUF gap analysis area. For this year, we've actually decided to leave that more open. And the only thing we're asking for is we would like to see, if it is going to be work on materials, it would be nice to see that work on radioactive or radiated materials. Beta gamma only, alpha bearing materials are not generally sought after for this FOA. We may go back to some specific focus areas in the future if we find that there's something that we need to do, but right now it's completely open. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So there is one excluded area. Someone had mentioned NSUF 2.2, where the NSUF funds the high performance computing resources at INL, at least a good portion of them, and then offers those out to users at no cost to them. So applications requesting scientific computing equipment will not be entertained. Certainly, if you have specific questions, you can ask about that. They'll probably end up getting posted to the website so everyone can see the answer. But the easiest answer is don't ask for scientific computing equipment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the merit review criteria for GSI is a little bit different than for the reactor. Obviously, you don't see the safety and security, operational reliability here. You see a little bit more emphasis on impact, a little more on utilization and execution. You see NSUF priority. So this is where the NSUF can step in and say, yep, that's a thing we don't have, or we've noted that in our gap analysis report. Yep, we could really use that, or as something along those lines. And then finally, at the bottom, we see educational innovation. This is a whole new section here for this FY22 FOA. And this is the uses of equipment for educational purposes. So while this was always part of the FOA before, this particularly wasn't here in the merit review criteria. So this will actually allow us to point out and give specific points to people that want to use their equipment for educational purposes. And certainly if it has research capability as well, then that can get points in other areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I did mention cost sharing, cost matching. So above $250,000, you'll have to put in 1-to-1 up to the project ceiling of $5 million. So there's an example here. There's another example in the FOA. There's no doubt this is familiar to most people. This is just required for this part of the FOA. Cost sharing is encouraged, but not required. And once again, I'm not going to be able to answer specific questions other than doing the math, and I'm sure we all can do that. That would fall to the Idaho Operations Office. Next slide, please. So best practices, we've mentioned some of these in the FOA. We'd like to attract high quality students. So things that would make a difference with that. Building research and educational capabilities, and enhancing the institution's capabilities to perform DOE any relevant research. So certainly those things are right on the target for good proposals for this application. We'd also like to see things that focus on a single synergistic goal or capability, and avoid what you might describe as a shopping list. Well, because there's only one application allowed per university, sometimes it's tempting to say, well, Professor so-and-so wants this, somebody else wants this, and we'll put together the whole thing. And if it's coherent, then that's probably a good application. If it's hard to sort of see how these things fit together, or they don't, then maybe it's not as good as a capability or an application. And then finally, trying not to duplicate existing capabilities. So we can see what exists around the US, the national labs, and some universities at the NSUF's Nuclear Energy Infrastructure Database, available at that website. And you will have to register, but there's no cost or just one step in registration. And then we also ask you to specifically list DOE any program relevance. If an application just says relevant to these 10 programs, well, okay, I'd like to see a little bit more in that. But that's certainly up to you as to how you write it. Next slide, please. Thank you. Some pitfalls to avoid. These are in the FOA, restrictions on how you can spend the funding. Once again, you're happy to ask me, and I'm just going to point you to the DOE ID people to give you the specifics on this. As was mentioned before, make sure you have the most recent version of the FOA. That will be available at grants.gov, with probably a courtesy copy at the NEUP website. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then finally, the contact information. You can reach me at the NSUF thing. That'll actually make sure it goes to me and then to someone else if I'm out at the time. There's the infrastructure FOA Q&A information at that website. You saw that before, and that's in the FOA. Our procurement questions can go to our contract specialist, Andrew Ford. And as I mentioned, the applications will go into NEUP.gov. So I've left a few minutes for questions. Are there any?
Okay, Brendan, right now we have one question. Can a PI from one university submit a GSI and a reactor upgrade proposal in the same year? And, well, I guess this is a double question. And are you eligible to apply if you currently have an ongoing reactor upgrade project?
So yes and yes. So I believe it was 2015 or 2016 that the issue of having an ongoing project was removed, and we are still getting that question. So I'm glad the question was asked. But yes, that doesn't make a difference.
Okay, our next question, I can answer this for the community. These slides and all the video recordings will be posted within a couple of weeks on NEUP.gov, and you can find all those resources there at that time. Let's see, oh, here's one more question that just came in. Would a reactor beamline installation project be considered for a reactor upgrade application or a GSI application?
I'm thrilled that finally somebody split the hair that finally. I think that's a great question. I think it really could fit both. Now, I will say, it would probably score worse in the reactor upgrade on the safety, security, and operational reliability part of it, but probably high on the others. You'd have to really figure out what you thought about it. I guess the short version is I think it's eligible for both. It would be an appropriate proposal for either one.
Okay, it looks like that's all the questions we have today in this presentation. So at 3 p.m. Eastern time, we will do the NSUF overview and NSUF 1 and 2 work scope presentation. Thank you so much, Brendan.
Thank you.